Hello, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Shihoko Goto, the Acting Director of the Asia Program at the Wilson Center. For those of you who are logging into a Wilson Center event for the first time, a very warm welcome to you. The center was established as an act of Congress in 1968 as a living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. We are an institution that remains staunchly nonpartisan and committed to bringing together the world of policymakers and the world of ideas focused on foreign policy. Next month, the United States will be hosting APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, which will bring together representatives from 21 member economies to San Francisco. Since its establishment in 1989, APEC membership has expanded across the Indo-Pacific to North and Latin America, and APEC members account for nearly 40% of the global population and about half of global trade. Washington sees APEC as a key forum to advance U.S. economic policies and trade interests that would also promote rules-based order amongst and beyond the member economies. But what is the U.S. vision for a rules-based economic order that would be attractive to its allies and win over new partners as well? Washington will be pushing forward with IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, its roadmap for greater cooperation and coordination amongst like-minded economies that would address key issues such as supply chain resiliency and sustainable growth. But is IPEF what U.S. allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific really looking for from the United States when it comes to promoting competitiveness and resilience moving forward? The San Francisco summit also comes at a time when U.S. foreign policy is focused on two critical fronts in Ukraine and in the Middle East. There is no APEC consensus when it comes to dealing with Russia or with the Israel-Hamas conflict, but certainly there is growing concern amongst the Indo-Pacific member countries about the U.S. ability to remain committed to Asia as developments in these two theaters continue to dominate the U.S. foreign policy agenda. Can and does the United States want to remain a Pacific power? And how are expectations for the United States as an economic as well as military presence in the Indo-Pacific changing from within the region? I am delighted to be able to bring three analysts who will be able to shed light on these and other questions. First, we have Ashley Tellis, the Tata Chair for Strategic Affairs and a Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Previously, he served in the U.S. government in a number of capacities, including as Senior Advisor to the U.S. Ambassador to India and as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Strategic Planning and Southwest Asia on the National Security Council. I'm also very pleased to welcome Scott Marciel, an Oxenberg Rollin Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. Previously, he was U.S. Ambassador to Myanmar and U.S. Ambassador to Indonesia. He also served as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for East Asia and the Pacific at the State Department. And finally, I'm very happy to be joined by my colleague, Lucas Myers, the Senior Associate for Southeast Asia with the Asia Program here at the Wilson Center, and a member of the State Department's Emerging Quad Think Tank Leader Initiative. So with that, let me turn to you first, Ashley. Where does this upcoming APEC meeting in San Francisco fit into Washington's broader efforts to expand partnerships and alliances in the Indo-Pacific? And how have U.S. strategic interests in the region evolved in recent years?
So thank you, Shihoko, for having me at this conversation with three esteemed colleagues, including yourself. Let me take a crack at that very directly. I think there is no doubt that the forthcoming APEC meeting is very important to the United States for several reasons. First, there are doubts in the region about, as you pointed out, the staying power of the United States. And that's primarily because of developments in our own domestic politics. There are deepening cleavages in the international system. We have seen that very graphically in the context of Ukraine, equally graphically in the context of the crisis with Israel and Hamas in Gaza. And there are fears that US-China competition is going to intensify a fragmentation of the global economic system. And that is of particular concern to the APEC's membership, because the APEC members have benefited from the globalization of the last 30-odd years. And so given all these realities, this is an important moment for the United States to do three things. First, it has to allay concerns about the commitment that the United States has to global leadership, to constructive global leadership. Two, it has to try and reconstruct a consensus among APEC members behind the commitment to preserving a liberal international order, both in its political dimensions and in its economic dimensions. And third, I think it has to reassure the broader Indo-Pacific spaces that the US is going to remain engaged as a great power protector on the security front, that it is going to be a constructive partner on the economic front, that it has not given up on the broad agenda of maintaining a rules-based economic order. And that's going to be very difficult for reasons that we can talk about in this conversation. So this meeting comes at a time when the US is buffeted by multiple challenges, which it has to address. And I would argue that at the level of public diplomacy, I think President Biden's appearance and the US presence at the meeting is likely to be a success, because there will be a variety of announcements that I think will be quite satisfactory on multiple fronts. But there is going to be a great deal of attention that is paid to what actually happens on the sideline of the meetings. And the most important issue on the sideline of the meetings right now will be the question of whether Presidents Biden and Xi meet. It looks increasingly likely that that will happen. And more importantly, whether that meeting will result in a stabilization of US-China competition. Because one of the strong and intensifying fears in the region is that the momentum in this competition is moving towards the destructive end of the spectrum, that there seems to be no end in sight to where this competition is headed. There seem to be no clear understandings of the parameters of this competition, and the very stark lack of trust, both in Washington and Beijing, have become really unnerving to the bystanders, both in APEC particularly and in the region more widely. So I think there will be a very eager audience waiting to see what comes out of the APEC event, not just in the meeting itself, but also on the sidelines. Now, I've said a lot, and there are many corollaries to what I've said, which I suspect we will have an opportunity to develop over the next hour of our conversation.
Thank you, Ashley. There's so much to follow up on, including how to build back trust. But we can come back to that later. I'd like to turn to Scott. So Ashley's just laid out some of the things that we should be looking out for, some of the burning issues that APEC members are concerned about. I'd like to turn to you really to address what some of the key strategic issues are for the United States in the Indo-Pacific, and whether those interests can actually be addressed in an international forum like APEC that is so diverse and divided, and also about how the United States engages with the ASEAN countries as well, when we no longer really talk about ASEAN centrality or ASEAN unity. America has its favorites. You could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, thanks very much, Hoko. And as always, Ashley, I think, has done a really good job of laying out the broad outlines. And I certainly echo everything that he said, but I'll try not to duplicate it. And I will talk a little bit about ASEAN centrality. But first, maybe a couple of words about the rules-based order, regional architecture in APEC, and how I think it plays in Southeast Asia. I mean, APEC was really, one of the early post-Cold era efforts to promote this rules-based order, although I don't think we call it that at the time. But, the idea was APEC would bind economies together and also set rules to govern trade and investment. I think it's important to note that APEC's prominence really coincided with a period when the U.S. was at the apex of its power in the post-Cold War period in the 1990s, maybe early 2000s. As that dominance has declined due to China's rise and the development of many other countries and other fora like the East Asia Summit, I would argue APEC's strategic importance as an institution or as a forum has declined, although it's still valuable in many ways, including as an opportunity for leaders to meet, like a potential Biden-Xi visit in San Francisco or meeting in San Francisco. But now we have more of an ASEAN-centered regional architecture with ASEAN-shared summits, ASEAN Regional Forum, the East Asia Summit. They serve also a useful purpose in bringing the great powers together with middle powers and certainly with ASEAN. But frankly, they've also struggled to address the major issues. And I think as a result, you're seeing the development in recent years of other fora and initiatives, China's Belt and Road, the BRICS, the Quad, AUKUS, and sort of the whole alphabet soup of different fora, many of which are efforts by either China or the United States to bolster their influence in the Asia Pacific and in the world. And ASEAN has sought to promote itself as a primary focus of the architecture with ASEAN centrality. But as you noted, it's been hampered by its own internal divisions over the South China Sea, over Russia, Ukraine, over Myanmar, and certainly most recently over Israel and Gaza. And the U.S. approach, as a result, has evolved, still with the twin goals of bolstering U.S. influence and maintaining the rules-based order, which I think means don't let China, and to a certain extent Russia, upend that order. But my own view is the U.S. strategic interest, particularly in Southeast Asia, is not so much countering China or certainly winning over China, but rather supporting the sovereignty and freedom of maneuver of the countries of Southeast Asia and the broader Asia Pacific. In other words, supporting them so that they're not in a position where they have to always accommodate China. The U.S. has also worked to develop the Quad and AUKUS, not so much as institutions, but more as fora or associations to bring like-minded countries together to support broader goals. It's important here to stress that the members of these organizations are not, or these fora are not really in lockstep, especially I would say India. They have some common goals and some common interests, but they have different approaches on many issues. So the U.S. has been promoting these approaches, but also continuing to work bilaterally. In the old days, when I started my career in diplomacy in Southeast Asia, everything was based on the two treaty allies, the Philippines and Thailand, plus Singapore as a strategic partner. That's changed. Philippines is still an important treaty ally, certainly. Singapore and Vietnam have become important partners, certainly not allies, but important partners. Thailand is still ostensibly an ally, but a less aligned ally, if I can use that term. And I think this U.S. evolved approach with a lot of flexibility has been right, but it's hampered by a couple of big problems. One that you and Ashley have both mentioned is the U.S. tendency to engage episodically in Southeast Asia. We get distracted by other issues as right now. But even sometimes without those other major issues, the U.S. has sometimes failed to pay enough attention or consistent attention to the region. And what that means is the region's Southeast Asians have less confidence in the U.S. commitment and long-term staying power, and that affects their decision-making. Second, the U.S., like China, still spends too much time and effort in the region trying to convince the countries that their opponent is bad and shouldn't be relied on. This is really a wasted effort because Southeast Asia is committed to maintaining, all of Southeast Asia is committed to maintaining good ties with both the United States and China. And in fact, they're promoting more what I would call a multipolar world in our region with increasing relations with India, Japan, Australia, and Korea. The U.S. approach is also hampered by the weakness on the trade and economic side, which means reduced influence, especially compared to China. And you've seen this with multiple surveys of Southeast Asian attitudes, which generally show the belief that China has much more economic influence than the United States in the region. Not that people necessarily love that, but that's just a reality. Chihoko, you mentioned IPEF. It's certainly an effort to change that. But at this point, I would say the skeptics probably outnumber the optimists on that. Let's hope that that changes. And last, U.S. language on democracy versus authoritarianism and on maintaining rules-based order really doesn't resonate very well in Southeast Asia. It's not that the region's anti-U.S., but certainly people see some hypocrisy and double standards. Also, countries tend to be more focused on practical and economic issues, the reality of the day, rather than the more ideological views. And so when we talk about democracy, for example, it's not that the United States shouldn't support democracy. Of course it should, but it needs to be more nuanced and recognize that these slogans and sort of democracy versus authoritarianism language doesn't really help. Finally, on ASEAN, it is divided over many issues, but it's not really divided between pro-China and pro-US countries. This is not a Cold War type alignment. Some countries lean more toward China, some more toward the United States, but that may depend on the issue. For example, Indonesia seems to be leaning more toward China on the economy, but more toward the United States on security. And it also changes over time. So it's really important not to overreact to high-level visits or announcements that one side, one major power is, quote, winning over the other. Instead, we've got to be prepared for a period of lots of fluidity when we need a lot of flexibility and nuance. We, the United States, needs to rely on its partners, Japan, Korea, Australia, India, even while accepting that their approach, for example, on promoting democratic values, might not match ours. So we need to have a less rigid, more tolerant and patient approach. ASEAN's not likely to suddenly become strong and unified. Doesn't mean it's not valuable, but we need to be realistic. And finally, we need to keep communicating and consulting with ASEAN members on things like Quad, AUKUS, keeping in mind that Southeast Asian countries tend to be wary and sometimes even suspicious of us and China to some extent. So we need to keep that in mind. And last but not least, we need to up our economic game. APEC can be part of that, but what's really needed is something significant on the trade side. I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you so much, Scott. You've laid so much on the table. And I really do want to come back to this idea of the United States partnering with like-minded countries like Korea and Japan, as well as India, to advance in Southeast Asia. But let me first turn before that to Lucas. Scott did talk about democracy and democratic values not being the force unifier for ASEAN countries. But we see that interests and values have really been a defining policy for the Biden administration, and they've certainly been keen to promote it in Southeast Asia in the first couple of years of coming into office. But as the United States focuses more on the adherence to the rule of law rather than to democracy, are we seeing a change in how we define what like-minded partners are? Does that give us greater flexibility in defining partnerships and alliances?
And thank you, Shihoko, and thank you to my esteemed colleagues on this panel. That's exactly right. I think the ambassador said it correctly, that oftentimes a values-based foreign policy can run into some discomfort in the Indo-Pacific. But that doesn't mean that it's not important in the administration's, especially their public diplomacy. The US Indo-Pacific strategy explicitly links these democratic values and the liberal elements of the rules-based order to its efforts. This is especially in comparison to the Trump administration's more transactional approach. And indeed, many of our closest allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific are democracies, right? Japan, Australia, South Korea, Taiwan. And we also spend quite a bit of money in the region on these issues. Per the White House in fiscal year 22, 23, and 24, the US aimed to provide $9.5 billion in support of democratic norms, human rights, and governance issues. And in some countries like Myanmar and Cambodia, the US policy towards them is often, very much through the lens of democracy and human rights. And, in the speech in 2021, President Biden came out very strongly saying that US diplomacy should be rooted in America's most cherished democratic values, defending freedom, championing opportunity, upholding universal rights, respecting the rule of law, and treating every person with dignity. And the first challenge actually to that agenda came a few days prior to that, when the military in Myanmar launched a coup against the democratically elected government of Aung San Suu Kyi. And so the White House jumped to action. It rallied support, especially giving out a quad statement at the upcoming summit, initiating targeted sanctions, and publicly denouncing the military takeover as a sign of its values-based approach. Later that year, it hosted the first Summit for Democracy, and a lot of its rhetoric highlighted that this challenge from Russia and China is largely democracies versus autocracies. But as the ambassador said, it soon became apparent that many countries in the Indo-Pacific don't feel completely comfortable with this overt values-forward foreign policy. And so many people, raised concerns about this. And I would say that we did see a shift. Even like-minded democracies like Australia and Japan are less inclined to promote democracy and human rights, especially, for instance, in Myanmar. And in addition to the different opinions on how much to counter China, this is a bit of a dilemma. And so while we do have an interest in democracy and human rights, our deep strategic interests, are countervailing push. And so I think we've seen some adjustment. So, I would say in the most stark example, the national security strategy in 2022 attempted to broaden some of this rhetoric. It says prominently that many non-democracies join the world's democracies in forswearing coercion and violence. And this is an attempt to incorporate more authoritarian or mixed regimes into a camp in favor of the rules-based order. And especially in the Indo-Pacific, given the diversity of our allies and partners there, this is really important, especially as in Southeast Asia. And you can even see that there's this balancing act here, right? And that the US is attempting to shift a bit more in the way of strategic interests and supporting outreach to allies and partners, largely from the desire to increase engagement across the board. For instance, President Biden recently traveled to Vietnam to sign a comprehensive strategic partnership with the government in Hanoi. This is a huge win and a massive gain in the US-Vietnam relationship across the board. It's not only about China, it's also about the economy. There was a bunch of investments highlighted, for instance, in semiconductors. These are all very important interests. And while the president was very clear that he raised these issues in his discussions in Hanoi, we still desire stronger relations with the communist government in Hanoi. And so there is this balancing act here that the US has to work out. It's going to shift. I think another good example of where this balancing act ends up in leading U.S. policy down different roads is in Myanmar and Thailand, which I think there's a lot of comparisons that can be made. So in Myanmar, obviously, the United States has been one of the most forward-leaning countries in supporting the democracy movement against the military takeover in 2021. We've obviously sanctioned the military through a variety of means and mechanisms, including this summer we've escalated those sanctions quite a bit in a very targeted way on the banking sector, for instance. But one of the main sources of revenue for the junta, the Myanmar oil and gas enterprise, we've refrained from sanctioning largely out of concern for Thailand, because Thailand is very much invested in that enterprise. And in Thailand, they had their own coup in 2014, and while that did lead to a downturn initially in U.S. relations with Thailand, since then we've improved with Thailand, largely for a few strategic reasons. There's concern in Washington that Thailand was getting too close to China, and there's a desire to make sure that that doesn't go too far. Additionally, Thailand is a very important economic partner, obviously in IPEF, and they remain a mutual treaty ally, even if the alliance has been less emphasized in recent years. So overall, I would say that this balancing act is going to shift. On one hand, the U.S. does have a desire to promote democracy and human rights. It spends quite a bit of money on this. It's very prevalent in its public diplomacy, and I would say that it does drive policy towards countries like the coup in Myanmar. But at the same time, we have these other strategic interests that we have to support, and that means engaging with countries that are not necessarily as like-minded as we would perhaps hope for. And that's how the administration sees it, I think, and they're shifting a bit to accommodate that. But that doesn't mean that won't shift again in the future, or that there's a perfect balance of values versus strategic interests. I think it's a bit of a moving target. It's going to depend upon a variety of outcomes. And in Southeast Asia, where there's a huge variety of regime types and a diversity of interests, I think the U.S. is going to have to perhaps think of a longer-term approach to its values-based issues. For instance, supporting democracy and civil society over the long term, and not necessarily pushing it too hard in its relations with countries like Thailand that remain very strategic. And so overall, I think this is a key issue and something that the U.S. is not going to be able to easily solve tomorrow.
No, thank you so much, Lucas. I also think promoting the United States as an aspirational country is something that the United States can do in terms of soft power as well. I am reassured by all of your comments that although there is concern about the United States demonstrating its commitment and reassuring its allies and partners in Southeast Asia and across the Indo-Pacific about U.S. commitment as Pacific power, but there is no real retreat of the United States from the region that you are anticipating. So I mention this because in 2010, as you recall, when then President Obama gave the big pivot or rebalance to Asia speech before the Australian Parliament, there was a collective sigh of relief across the Indo-Pacific, saying that finally the United States is focusing less on the Middle East, more on Asia, and it's a comprehensive approach to Asia. It isn't simply about U.S. security relations. It is about economic engagement. It is about political engagement and the like. Is there, Ashley, when you talk about ensuring that there is reassurance of partners, what does it take? Is it just like dollars and cents, and we have to come up with a better trade agreement, more investments in infrastructure, or is there something else that can be done?
So that's a very big and complicated question, but I think there are 2 or 3 dimensions that I would flag. The first dimension is actually beyond our control in a paradoxical sort of way, because it goes to the question of what is the churn in US domestic politics and what will be thrown up as a result of that churn. And throughout the Indo-Pacific, elites are concerned at the possibility that the next US election might see the return of Donald Trump. And if Donald Trump ascends once again to the office of the presidency, the question of what impact that will have on the US role in the world, including all the tasks of reassurance, will once again be open questions and unnerving questions. Now, this is not something that the current dispensation in Washington can do anything about, but it is simply a reality that others observe and take very seriously because they saw the first iteration of this consequence and they were alarmed by it. And this was visible throughout the Indo-Pacific. So this is one reality that we have to focus on. The second is that there is a growing fear that the United States is gradually turning its back on an open economic order. The idea that we were committed to after the Second World War, which is a progressive expansion of the trading system, a progressive reduction of tariffs, creating new rules that would enlarge commerce essentially through economic intercourse across boundaries and so on and so forth. It is alarming to many countries in the Indo-Pacific that today the United States has two political parties, both of which are anti-trade, both of which are deeply uncomfortable with facing up to questions of reciprocal market access, both of which seem very comfortable with a return to old-style industrial policies, and so on and so forth. Now, these directions, have consequences. And it alarms states that have benefited from the open trading order. And so when you ask the question of what is it that the United States must do, part of what we must do is sort of deeply examine whether what we are doing for narrow conceptions of national interest actually serve our larger objective of building a stable international system that behaves according to the very rules that we ourselves promulgated, several decades ago. The last dimension, which I think is equally serious, though doesn't receive as much visible attention, is increasingly questions about whether the United States will be able to effectively underwrite its extended deterrence obligations. This has become a problem because of the rise of Chinese military power. And I think there is a fear that although Washington is throwing a lot of money at the problem, so we have the world's largest defense budget, which shows no sign of, reducing anytime soon, that these investments may nonetheless not be adequate or appropriate to the challenges that we face. And if that is the case, and you see these concerns most visible in countries like Japan, what does this mean for US extended deterrence? What does this mean for the stability of the alliance system? And so on and so forth, if we end up in a real crisis. So when you ask the question of what is it that we should do, my God, the list is endless. But I would say we have to at least address these three axial elements. The first question we have to ask is whether we are serious about sustaining US leadership, in which case I think we will need to repair the domestic consensus behind that commitment, and that's easier said than done. Second, we've got to really recommit to upholding an open trading system. And, while I'm a great fan of what the Biden administration is trying to do, I think the best I can say for IPEF is that it's better than nothing. But it's certainly not a substitute for the kind of trading arrangements that we ourselves negotiated, a couple of decades ago. And then last, I think we have to be deadly serious about understanding the nature of the extended deterrence problem and making the right investments that will reassure our allies that if push comes to shove, we will actually be able to come to their defense effectively.
Thank you. I think when on the trade front, it's easy to say, well, the United States should simply provide market access as part of IPEC, and this would signal U.S. Economic leadership. I think the challenge, of course, is that the United States is not operating in a vacuum, that on the trade front, there are alternatives that are moving forward, and there is the CPTPP that has not just succeeded even without the United States, it's actually flourished. And it's expanding beyond the Indo-Pacific and Latin America, and it's also now including Europe through the UK. And so to say that there is no global appetite for open markets and fair trade is actually a folly, that there is great appetite and there is platforms to move forward on that. Scott, I don't know, I want to go back to the question that you raised about the role of these Southeast Asia countries hedging against the United States by partnering more with Korea, Japan, India, whether that is simply a blip or limited to certain sectors or a handful of select countries, or whether this is a more sustained trend that these countries are actually serious about committing themselves to Southeast Asia, and that there is going to be a partnership flourishing that will require less and less US engagement and visibility.
Thanks. Let me first say that I think Ashley really nailed the answer to your last question. So thanks, Ashley, for all those points, which I fully agree with. I think there is, we tend to look at Southeast Asia, you hear talk US-China battleground in Southeast Asia, which is problematic in so many ways, and as if these countries are somehow prizes to be won. All of the countries of Southeast Asia very much value their independence. They have agency in maintaining their sovereignty. None of them says, I have a great idea, why don't we become a vassal state of a great power? So I think it's important to keep that in mind. And I don't know how much it's a conscious decision or how much it just comes out of their policymaking. They all, to varying degrees, value their relationships with China and value their relationship with the United States, even as they have some concerns about each of those relationships. But they also see that they can benefit a lot from good partnerships with other countries, such as the ones I mentioned, and that those countries also benefit. I don't think this is at all a bad thing for Southeast Asia or for the United States if our strategic goal is supporting the full independence and sovereignty of these countries. Even if that means them disagreeing with us at many occasions, that's still in our interest to support that freedom of maneuver. And so bolstering their ties with other countries makes it easier for them to resist undue pressure from any of the major powers. I don't think it's a matter so much of the US engaging less as a result. I certainly hope people in Washington don't take it that way. We certainly should be engaging more, especially on the economic and diplomatic front. I think it's more a matter of, for example, because Japan or India or Australia or others might have a different approach. Let's take Cambodia. Myanmar, I happen to think we're doing exactly the right thing by not engaging with the junta because they're so far beyond the pale. But let's look at Cambodia, where we've been unhappy with Hun Sen and by extension his son Hun Manet for many years because they kind of spoiled the plan for a democratic Cambodia in our views, and fair enough. But the sanctions and so on aren't helping. They're not actually advancing our goals. They're just reducing our influence. And this is where it's helpful if you have partners, allies, that are willing and able to engage more fully with Cambodia. So they're U.S. allies, but it's good that they're not in lockstep, because they're able to build relationships with Cambodia and so on. I don't think it undermines us really in any way. It's just where we, for whatever reasons, aren't able to engage as much as we want or maintain the influence we want. It's good for our partners and friends to have good relationships with a country like Cambodia. Again, it provides sort of more ballast for Cambodian decision makers. They may still decide to lean heavily toward China. That's their sovereign right as a country to do, but at least they have the options. They're not forced to do it. And so I see this as overall a big positive, but it requires Washington not to be flying to Delhi and Japan every week and saying, hey, you got to be harder on them, or you shouldn't be talking to them. And that's something we're not always great at.
On the issue of not forcing countries to choose and having the freedom of choice. I want to turn to you, Lucas, about the case of the Philippines and talk about the dynasty there, right? Who would have expected a Marcos to go from China to becoming a staunch ally of the United States? I mentioned that, and I also want to ask about the role of engagement and actually the people-to-people engagement at the highest level. Diplomacy, I think, Scott, as a seasoned diplomat, this is really your question, but I'm going to turn it to Lucas because I think he might offer a new generation perspective as well. Does it matter still for people to show up? Does it win hearts and minds?
No, yeah. So first of all, on the question of the Philippines, I mean, the way I see it is we're all going to be surprised on occasion. I mean, I was quite, my view going up to the election was that the Marcos Jr. regime would be much more, continue that Duterte's kind of, realignment and more towards China, but instead they've taken the opposite approach, and that I think is a really good development from a U.S. perspective. I mean, I think, the enhanced defense cooperation agreement, it's been expanding and there's more access to more locations. There's been a real renewal, with the U.S.-Philippine alliance, as you said, and I think that's a huge boon. And so maybe the lessons there are that the U.S. should not give up prematurely on these things and actually foster, like you said, people-to-people ties. I know, many in the Philippine bureaucracy, right? The foreign affairs, the sort of, military specialists, they were very much, not necessarily agreeing with Duterte, right, during that time. And I think those people-to-people ties are always there. And long term, that's a key element. Just from my own experience, recently I was in New Delhi and talking with Indian analysts, and this was something that really struck out was building these relationships is key, because long term, I think the U.S. it's not just about the high level visits. A lot of people talk about, President Biden missed the ASEAN summit this year, and that's a huge, failure or loss in some sense. But I think at the same time, we can really focus on these lower level enmeshments, like building relationships across bureaucracies, between cohorts, such as, between diplomats, between analysts, and that really doesn't mesh the relationship, I think, on a deeper level. For instance, the Wisely program has been a forefront of U.S. policy towards Southeast Asia, and it's been bringing together young Southeast Asian leaders into the U.S. and with their counterparts here, and that's been a huge boon, I think, for U.S. foreign policy on a level we don't often see at the highest end, but I think it does really improve our engagement, especially when there are competing interests at the top level. So if President Biden is unable to attend a summit for a variety of reasons, that doesn't mean that relationship is unattended to at a lower level. And I think that's important to maintain.
Thank you. Scott, just to kind of follow up on that, Biden not being able to attend the ASEAN meeting, the ASEAN ambassadorship being open for a very long time. How significant are these? How easy are these to actually remedy?
Well, they're important to remedy. I have to say that my first diplomatic assignment, one of the things I witnessed was Ferdinand Marcos Sr. leaving Manila after being forced out. So to see how it's come full circle, and I think we can also thank our friends in China for pushing Marcos to work more closely with the United States. But to answer your question, Shihoko, the ASEAN ambassadorship, I mean, we have a problem in Washington getting people confirmed. And I'm happy to blame the Senate, but it's not all on the Senate. The process at the White House Personnel Office is reduced to a glacial pace. So we just need to do a better job on that front. As for the president missing the summit, I mean, he missed it to go to Hanoi for a significant upgrade. So it's not that he was ignoring Southeast Asia. I know my friends in Indonesia were put off. It's good that President Biden, I assume in response to that, in part, invited President Jokowi to stop in Washington on the way to the APEC summit. I believe President Jokowi is still going to go. That's important. It's also a really important opportunity right now to talk about Gaza with Indonesia, because whatever you think about the U.S. approach, a lot of Indonesians are very unhappy with it. And it's, President Biden is not going to be able to win over Jokowi on this, but it's important to not only to engage him seriously on it and listen to him, but to be seen as engaging him seriously on this and treating him as a serious partner. And I think that can help a lot overcome the temporary loss. I think when it goes to summits, we make a big deal about presidents attending and not attending. People say, well, Xi Jinping never goes to those summits, which is, a fair criticism. On the other hand, nobody in Southeast Asia is doubting China's commitment to engagement. There's questions about U.S. commitment. And, the Obama team did it very well. The Trump team failed, but Trump himself failed miserably to maintain that engagement. I think the Biden team overall has. But per Ashley's point, people in Southeast Asia says, great, what happens after 2024? And so you need to, if you can build confidence in the region that we're committed and we're staying engaged, then you can afford to miss the occasional summit. But when they have those big doubts, then missing a summit hurts you a lot more. So you have to do both.
Okay. Thank you. Ashley, APEC membership, 21 economies right now. What about expanding it? Is there value in a country like India joining? What is the state of play there?
Well, India has become more enthusiastic about external openness in recent times. But that was not always the case. And the danger with sort of indiscriminate expansion of an organization like APEC is that you could get countries that are not committed to its core objective. And its core objective was essentially expanding the open trading system, right? That is what APEC was founded for. If the new Indian shift towards greater external openness is for real, and we have to test that, and only time will tell whether it's for real, then I think there's a strong case for including India in APEC. Now, most of the folk who make the argument that India should be admitted to APEC right away make the argument for geopolitical reasons, which is they see APEC as a proxy for a larger international conversation. And they wonder why a country like India, which is an emerging power, should be excluded. And I'm sympathetic to that, but not at the cost of subverting, the core objectives of the organization. So I think we should wait and see. But if India is serious about, expanding its trade relations with the international system, pursuing more free trade agreements as they seem to have embarked upon, is willing to make hard decisions about lowering tariffs, addressing the very serious problem of non-tariff barriers, and so on and so forth, then I think there is a compelling case, at some point to bring India into APEC. But I would really like to see that being the end result of some decisions made in Delhi before one crosses the threshold and deals with questions of membership.
Thank you for that. We're almost at the end of our hour, but I would like to ask one final question that we got from an audience member. I'd like all three of you to answer. It's from Kari Hatcher at GM, who asks, what would be considered a win for the US government coming out of APEC? Lucas, why don't I turn to you first?
I think above all, I think it's personal, President Biden meeting with important leaders in the Indo-Pacific and being able to showcase the improvement in relations with a variety of important partners. For instance, I'm thinking Vietnam. But additionally, I think the administration seems to want to be able to secure a meeting with President Xi Jinping of China. And if that happens, I think, there could be some, emergence of at least some sort of guardrails, at least from the administration's perspective on US competition with China. And that's what they're hoping to achieve with at least an in-person meeting. We'll see. I think the jury's still out on whether that'll happen, though.
Great. Scott.
Well, I think whether or not there's a Xi-Biden meeting, that topic and a potential meeting will dominate the headlines, I'm sure. And perhaps rightly so, because if they can at least put a floor under the relationship as a result of a meeting, that would be significant and really important. If there's no meeting or a really bad meeting and word leaks out about it, that obviously is going to make everyone a lot more nervous. As far as APEC itself, APEC has tended to accomplish a lot, but it's sort of under the headline stuff mostly. A lot of people in so-called bureaucrats, like I used to be, doing real work on stuff that isn't really glamorous but makes a difference. And I think reinforcing the commitment to deal seriously with climate change and as much as possible. We haven't talked about climate change. My view, with everything else going on in the world, this is still probably the biggest threat to the world in the next 30 or 40 years. And political leaders aren't overall doing a great job of dealing with it. So if APEC can move the ball forward even a little bit, reinforcing commitments, maybe some small technical victories, I think that would be significant.
Great. Ashley.
I agree with what Scott said completely. APEC's greatest achievements have been in the quotidian realm, right? It's not the headlines. It's the stuff that they have done on reducing behind the border barriers, tariff reductions, digital privacy, all those sorts of issues. So apart from the leaders, and hopefully there will be leader meetings that are productive and so on and so forth, I think the best thing that could happen is if APEC sort of commits itself to the tripod of the three big issues that face all its members in the global community. The first is climate change, and especially looking at issues of the technology transition and financing. That's a big one. The second is looking at the whole challenge of environmental sustainability, because the impact of climate change is going to be felt on many members in APEC, and they don't have the capacity necessarily to deal with those implications. And the third is the whole issue of disease and disaster management. I mean, we had a horrific reminder of what that was just a few years ago. And most of the epidemiologists who follow this say that we're not particularly prepared for the next pandemic that could come anytime. And so can we, without flourishes and histrionics, sort of create some building blocks of cooperation with respect to pandemic preparedness in terms of monitoring, surveillance, sharing of information, and then ideally, creating some platforms for collaboration and dealing with these challenges. So the whole issue of global bads, which have now become really pressing problems. And these are the issues that matter to most of the countries in APEC. The great powers in APEC, of course, have, big problems that they have to deal with, the so-called high politics of the system. But for most of the members, it's the low politics of the system, which is the bread and butter issues that they have to deal with day to day. And so if APEC can continue to make gains in these areas, under the headlines, I think that would be fantastic.
Right. And so on that note of cautious optimism, I'd like to conclude our discussion and thank you, all three of you, so much for joining us here today. Again, Scott Marcial, Ashley Tullis, Lucas Myers, it was great to have you. And hopefully you'll join us again soon. Bye-bye.